want to actually collect. So we'll be recording this event. So uh,
That's
I think
perfect.
disclaimer is that we are all speaking in our capacity, especially
Yeah.
for my friends from AIMS and CMCs. For me and Samir, we are always in our own capacity only. So I think that's the disclaimer. So as long as Anand doesn't want to quote himself as professor and head of AIMS, it's good. He can speak on his own behalf, right, Anand?
Yeah, right. No problem.
Yes. Okay, fine. So what we do is so uh, welcome my colleagues and my friends, and I think welcome to delegates who have already shown so much of enthusiasm and logged in right on time. So I think without wasting a lot of time, we will. I'll just quickly introduce my co-panelists and uh, my friends who are there with us who are already here. So I think going alphabetically first. So I will request Sachin to please close down the mics. Mic hut. So, firstly, I'd like to welcome Professor Anant Mohan, who's a very dear friend for many, many years. He heads the Department of Pulmonary Critical Care and Sleep Medicine at All India Institute of Medical Sciences, New Delhi. And I think very, very busy nowadays, along with Sir Dr. Leria, in making the national task force and getting the vaccine to us as soon as possible. So, welcome, Anand.
Thank you very much. Thanks. Pleasure to be here.
The next I welcome, I think, as per the alphabetical, Girish, my friend Dr. Girish, Professor Girish Sindwani from AIMS Rishikesh, a newer AIMS, but I think it has very rapidly taken up a great name in that particular area. A lot of patients who come to us from there speak very highly about the hospital and your department as such. So, thank you so much for joining in, Girish.
Thanks, Dr. Bharat. Pleasure to be in the meeting.
Next is Dr. Prince James from CMC Vellore. He's also professor now, and I'm seeing him after a long time. Little bit hair gone, but it's fine. I think we are all growing up, so it gives you a professor look. So
Thank you.
yeah. So welcome, Prince, and he's been a great friend. A lot of work in interventions and research, and a very very humble person. Thank you so much, Prince, for being a part.
Thank you, Dr. Bharat. Thank you.
And finally, Samir, who is like me, a private practitioner, and we have been in many, many meetings. And as I was saying, probably we tend to speak our mind a lot. So we have always enjoyed each other's company and have done a lot of meetings in past together. And very learned person, very practical, and I think you all will love hearing his thoughts on the topic. Welcome, Samir.
Thank you, Bharat. Thank you so much for
So
inviting for this
quickly,
meeting.
I'll give all of you a minute each to just give your thoughts on the topic in one line, and then we start with the talk. So, Anand, you first.
Okay, thank you. I think this meeting is very well timed. Kind of the topic, the topics, the forum of discussion, the topics which are planned to be spoken about today. Because now 7, 8 months, 8, 9 months into the pandemic, now we are of course seeing the new cases, but now we are also seeing the complications of the new cases. We are seeing the long-term sequelae in whatever form they may be, and that itself is a learning experience, a new experience. Again, the number of questions are probably much more than the answers, and it is likely to remain so for the next few months also, till we have more and more experience with this. But nonetheless, I think the personal experiences of everybody who are into this the business of treating these patients is very important, because ultimately that will help everybody to see the practical aspects. What is published always does not give the true picture. They are all very the clinical trials are all very well designed, but they are managed and they are carried out in a different kind of setting. The practical world is different, and that is where these kind of meetings help. And I'm sure today, after Bharat talks about what we know about various aspects, and then I think we'll have a good interactive session, and I would look forward to interacting with everybody and learning more about all these things. So I think it's a very well timed meeting. So all the best.
Very well said. So, Girish, your thoughts?
Yeah, Dr. Bharat, absolutely agree with Dr. Anand. The experience at every center counts. Every center experience matters. as we gather and discuss more and more of our experiences, and based on whatever literature we have right now on long COVID or post COVID sequelae, that this experience and discussion on this is absolutely going to be helpful for us also and for the audience also. So thanks for planning this meeting.
Thank you. Most welcome. Prince, how bad is the situation in Bangalore and around? Firstly,
By God's grace, is better than Delhi. I will say. We keep seeing Delhi and keep fearing, but till now, by God's grace, going well. We didn't have any. I mean, touch wood, no
Major surge.
second or third wave. So very well timed. This meeting, I think, last 1 year was completely changing, and as well as the guidelines and the treatment recommendation, everything so rapidly changing. It's important to meet and share the experience across, even in our country, to know what's happening and how to move forward. Thank you for planning this meeting.
Great. And finally, Sameer.
Yeah, hi Bharat. I totally agree with everyone else that is a perfectly timed meeting. This is a situation where hand holding is of utmost importance. And what I have learned in this last 8 months is you cannot totally keep depending all the time on everything that you read in the literature. Experiencing and learning from your experiences and observations and sharing all that with your peers is very, very important. So if I have some observation, I share with you, you have some observation, you share with me, and together we walk this path and get out of this tunnel as soon as possible. So thanks a ton for inviting us for this meeting.
I think the pleasure is all ours, and thank you so much. So, without wasting much time, if you allow, I will start with the presentation, right? And probably from that aspect, we will take it forward. So the idea is going to be, we are almost in time with the introduction, we will just do a small talk, trying to look at whatever is available with us as of now, right? And from there, we move to the question answers and the discussion part with you. So you can sit back and relax till I present. If you need to stop me and discuss something which is very important at this time, we can always take a break. Otherwise, we will discuss those things in the end. So you will be surprised that in April 2019, this novel actually came out, The Pandemic Century. And I think nobody actually bothered till we actually hit the pandemic. And the opening letters are the only thing that is certain is that there will be new plagues and new pandemics. And it's not a question of if, but when. And this is something which we have known. But surprisingly, when it actually came, we all were still quite shortchanged. And we were probably still not prepared to the way we should have been all over the globe. So that was a very, very surprising part. And from there, couple of days, 3 days back, we had 90-year-old Margaret Keenan being the first person to receive the vaccine, a ray of hope in these dark times. And you would be surprised. Do you know who was the second one? His name was William Shakespeare. So just on the lighter side, the second person and the first man on this planet to get a COVID jab is named William Shakespeare. So as we begin in this slightly difficult topic, I think this is the lighter side I wanted to share. Nature actually presented a commentary or an editorial a few months back, where I think it was probably the first time when they actually wrote down about COVID-19's lasting misery. So moving away from the COVID symptoms and the problems of COVID, the deaths due to COVID, they started looking at this editorial actually looked at the patients and their experiences months after infection with SARS-CoV-2, as they still battled fatigue, lung damage, and an array of other symptoms. And if you look at this so-called very dramatic pictures of lung scans from a 50-year-old, this would show that this is at the active COVID level. This is 6 weeks after discharge. This is 12 weeks. But look at even after 12 weeks, there are areas of lung which still are showing those red patches or on these lung scans, which are suggestive of involvement. So all is still not good in many patients even 3 months down the line after COVID. This is one of our very, very early patients where we were so surprised, we were so probably disappointed that although we were able to save this patient, this is somewhere in June, and this patient who was a diabetic 50-year-old CAD, with a lot of effort, we were able to send him. But on day 23, when we were sending him obviously on oxygen, the scans which we saw were unbelievable. And we could not actually believe that how the alveolar shadowing which was there could actually end up with, because those were the times when we were not doing scans so rapidly, so frequently in these patients of once they were going home. And so this was our first, probably for me, it was early June or mid-June when firstly we started thinking that probably some portion of those patients are going for a tough time in future. And as you see, you will be surprised that there was a study from China somewhere in March or April, just after they were hit with COVID. And they started actually, this study was published almost at that time, where they actually looked at long-term bone and lung consequences associated with hospital-acquired severe acute respiratory syndrome. So these were patients of SARS in 2003 who were healthcare workers. They developed SARS because they were working in the hospitals. And they actually followed these patients up for next 15 years till 2018. And they found that percentage of lesions rapidly decreased from 2003 to 2004. This is something which we all know and probably gives us a ray of hope that a lot of patients of SARS who had SARS-induced pulmonary lesions usually recovered to a greater extent within 1 year after rehabilitation. So this is something which is often spoken, and this is often told by all our peers that, okay, most of the patients will improve. Now, this study actually looked at 15-year follow-up, and they found that even after 15 years, 4.6% still had visible lesions, and 38% had reduced lung capacity or diffusion capacity. So that is something, if we don't know if we can extrapolate from SARS-CoV-1, but this is the data available till 2020 April, when this paper was published. So this was up to 2018, that after 15 years, 4.6% still had visible lesions and 38% had reduced lung capacity. So that is not a very, very good scenario. As we look at this acute phase of pandemic, we would know that, okay, 95% will have no to moderate symptoms, will get better. And I think those are the people who go around roaming around and saying, okay, I got better, nothing happens. COVID is a fluke, COVID is a myth. But ask these 5% who 5% of the total number of people who are infected all over the world. So that makes a large number. And these are severe to critical patients. Almost 30 to 50% only finally go up to recovery. 20% of these 5% die. But then this is another 30 to 50%, unfortunately, who land up with post-COVID sequelae, and mainly being post-COVID fibrosis or post-COVID inflammatory fibrosis. So whatever you may call it, but these are the patients who would land up with problems. So this is something which unfortunately doesn't get highlighted a lot. And that's why people the common public is not a lot aware. So the relationship between lung injury and fibrosis is well described. Indeed, much of it is understood about the development of pulmonary fibrosis is based on the data obtained from in vivo models of lung injury. Any infection, bacterial, viral, has a potential to cause airway epithelial injury. And apoptosis, and both of these have capacity to modulate the host response to injury. So this is something which we already know about pulmonary fibrosis and various other, because of various other aspects. The mechanism of post-viral lung fibrosis has been extensively studied, especially in relation to viral epidemics like the influenza, H1N1, and SARS-CoV-1. And maybe this knowledge from past, as one of the papers I showed, might educate us as we head into something of an unknown future. We do not know what is going to happen with our SARS-CoV-2 patients. So probably we may have to extrapolate the knowledge, and probably the knowledge which we gain hands-on as we manage these patients. I'll not go into the nitty-gritties of how the fibrosis occurs. Probably a simple aspect is to understand that the acute or chronic inflammation leads to alveolar epithelial damage, leading to overexpression of pro-inflammatory cytokines, usually the TGF beta and TNF alpha and IL-6, which finally lead to the fibroblast and myofibroblast activation, leading to excessive deposition of collagen in extracellular matrix, and finally leading to the advent of pulmonary fibrosis. So this is a sort of pathway which has been described in various other post-viral fibrosis and also in SARS-CoV-2. Something which is described differently in SARS-CoV-2 induced fibrosis is the pivotal role of angiotensin II. Can we have people shut their mics, please? Thank you. So SARS-CoV-2 infection may lead to the decrease in the ACE2 receptor representation, leading to also TGF beta levels high, the angiotensin II levels high. Finally, the same path leading to myofibroblast activation and the accumulation of in the extracellular matrix, finally leading to lung fibrosis. Not only this, you already have add-on if the patient goes onto the ventilator, so you have ventilator associated lung injuries, and sometimes the effect of overuse of oxygen, which is leading to hyperoxia effects. I'm sorry, Sachin, can you mute the mics of the delegates? Thank you. So the hypothesis is very shaky. It's almost like we are trying to describe fibrosis in any other patient. So the easiest thing to remember out of this busy slide is there is dysregulated repair once the viral injury starts. The failing repair may manifest as an over-exuberant immune response, which finally leads to excessive fibroblast proliferation and leading to pulmonary fibrosis. So this is something which we probably now understand as of now. What is the background and prevalence of post-COVID fibrosis? So this was a paper in July where they looked at the prevalence of post-discharge symptoms in ICU patients as compared to ward patients. And as expected, patients who went away from ICUs had more breathlessness as compared to the ward group once they were followed up in the OPD. Another single center study for individuals discharged from the hospital after recovery, well, only 18 out of these 143 were completely free of COVID-19 symptoms. So a lot of them had 1 or 2 symptoms, and more than half had almost 3 symptoms out of this whole list of fatigue, dyspnea, chest pain, cough, breathlessness, vertigo, myalgias, headaches. So all these, something or the other, kept on troubling them once they were discharged. In patients who recovered from COVID-19, 87% reported at least 1 symptom, particularly fatigue and dyspnea. So dyspnea continued to be in all these papers of post-COVID follow-up. Dyspnea continued to be one of the common presenting aspects on follow-up. The prevalence of COVID ILD as such is in nascent stage. Obviously, you can look at the CT scans and probably look at from that aspect how many patients have. So this is come out just in the morning today in the ERJ. It's ahead of print. So this particular study from Vienna, where they looked at around 180 odd patients, again showed that definitely acute COVID, we expected a lot of dyspnea, but the second follow-up after COVID, which was almost after 8 weeks, had almost 36% with dyspnea. So 41% of patients had after 100 days of onset of illness had some persistent symptom. Dyspnea was the commonest, and the surprising thing or the disheartening thing was that reduced diffusion capacity was almost there in 21% of this cohort, and this was one of the most prominent findings. Surprisingly, in their cohort, the cardiac impairment, including the reduced left ventricular function or signs of pulmonary hypertension, was only in minority, which somehow we all still tend to see in a lot of our patients. As far as the PFT goes, this study where they performed PFT 20 to 34 days after onset of illness, they found that 47% had impaired DLCO, 25% had reduced total lung capacity, and the coefficient factor was significantly lower in patients with severe disease, which implies maybe vasculopathy which had set in. So the hallmark of COVID we know is the endothelial dysfunction and vascular and pulmonary vasculopathy, and probably that may reflect in an impairment of gas transfer as we follow up these patients of post-COVID sequelae. This paper published by George in Thorax a couple of months back looked at the respiratory follow-up of patients with COVID-19 pneumonia, where these were high-risk patients, ICU with new oxygen prescription while going, or patients who required high inspired fractions of oxygen. And they looked at the radiological aspects of these patients. And what they found was that in these patients, almost 52% had adjacent pleural thickening, 48% had interlobular septal thickening, which were showing various types of conditions on the CT scans. But the important thing is that though we have understood how to interpret our CTs now, I think another good aspect of COVID, if you can look at positives as far as medical science is concerned, is a lot of people have now got used to probably looking at CT scans properly and looking at CT scans which they were only relying on reports. So the reporting has probably improved. So if you look at these patients, the patients could have almost a normal lung when they begin with. After 3 weeks, you have these inflammatory changes with interlobular septal thickening, few areas of ground glassing and consolidation. And as you follow these patients up for 6 weeks, you will find a lot of them will have only the fibrotic areas which are. This is a patient who was extubated. And if you see in even this patient, the pneumonia does not appear to resolve fully. And in some, the inflammation will mature into residual fibrosis. So this is something which as we have seen the surge in Delhi, Mumbai, and many other parts, we have seen sicker and sicker patients. We have pulled out severe patients as we begin to understand the disease as such. But as we get them out of that acute illnesses and we begin to send them home, a lot of these patients are unfortunately left with this residual pulmonary fibrosis. This is a very early study which I tried to dig in, and I found that even in Wuhan, they tried to look at this. Surprising, I do not know how much data actually came out of Wuhan, but this particular study said that even in the second or third week, if you look at the CT scan and the type of picture which was there, majority in second to third week had mixed type of picture. That means there were reticulations along with ground glassing. So by the third week, a lot of these patients had a predominant CT pattern which was mixed and not resolved by the third week. So to just summarize, HRC findings could be various. There could be fibrotic abnormality, reticular opacities, traction bronchiectasis, and unfortunately honeycombing. So these are the type of pictures which we used to get in patients who used to come with history of dyspnea for 1 year, 2 years, some exposure to dust, some exposure to of hypersensitivity pneumonitis, and we would say, okay, this probably it's now been many years. But these are CT scans of patients who have been ill for 3 weeks, 4 weeks. So within a month, this is a type of CT scans, unfortunately, these patients are left with. So the progression of disease has been detected as early as 3 weeks. The abnormal lung function has also been identified even at the time of discharge from the hospital and even 2 weeks after discharge. And this can be more extrapolated if we actually look at the post-mortem findings. This was a study from Northern Italy, where 2-center descriptive study. And what they found was that a lot of these patients had hyaline membrane formation when they died, atypical hyperplasias, a lot of thrombi in the presence was seen, which is consistent with the coagulopathy, which we now have understood is one of the main reasons of the patients succumbing in COVID. A patient of fatal pulmonary fibrosis, I don't know if you can see, but I've underlined that as you see these patients who were the post-mortem histopathological findings, and you would find that there is, at the beginning, there is a diffuse alveolar damage, as we expect in a lot of viral diseases. Then there is beginning of organization of immature fibroblast. These then create honeycomb-like remodeling. And I think these are the problems. And these are the patients where if we look back, are at risk of developing fibrosis. Why? See, because both organizing pneumonia and alveolar collapse are possible in COVID-19. due to the damage of both type 1 and type 2 pneumocytes. So there are chances of developing fibrosis are more. Extent of involvement of alveolar units, the more the involvement, more are the chances of repair and more are the chances of fibrosis. If the effective repair mechanism there, obviously the mechanisms will minimize the chances of fibrosis. The organizing pneumonia is cleared by alveolar macrophages. If fully cleared, then obviously they regenerate. The healing process may not lead to scarring. But if it is a dysregulated healing, you will have a lot of fibrosis. If the organizing pneumonia gets embedded in the alveolar wall, obviously there is scarring, there is regeneration of type 2 pneumocytes, and if that is not complete, may lead to fall. So I think the catch term is going to be the people who have epithelial dysfunction would be at more risk of developing interstitial pulmonary fibrosis in long-term follow-up. Any biomarkers for prediction? No sensitive biomarkers. Few experimental biomarkers which have been looked up are serum LDH, higher sensitivity CRPs, and lymphocyte counts. There are a couple of studies which show that LDH may reflect tissue destruction. Obviously, these are personal commentaries rather than actually studies which have been randomized. The LDH reflects tissue destruction and regarded as one of the common signs of cell damage in patients with severe pulmonary interstitial disease. The increasing LDH may be a good prognostic marker of lung injury. So I think obviously we are not very sure, but this is what those small studies are showing. Previous studies in ARDS have also detected few experimental biomarkers in bowel fluid, and they are like type 3 collagen, terminal propeptide of type 1 collagen, TGF-beta. These are more research and experimental rather than clinical relevance as of now. Any way to predict radiologically which patients would land up with pulmonary fibrosis? I think the patients who have early interstitial thickening, irregular interfaces, coarse reticular patterns, parenchymal bands, maybe these, if they in the course of disease, you get a CT and you find these, probably these may be predictors of pulmonary fibrosis in these patients. So we have looked at the pathogenesis, we have looked at the hypothesis behind, we have looked at the radiology, we have looked at the biomarker. So I think it is time we look at the therapy, because that's what, as practitioners, as physicians, we are more worried, or we are worried, what therapy do we give in these patients? And look at the CT scans again. The patients have moved within 7-10 days from an inflammatory type of stage to a fibrotic type of stage. So changes can be there in first, second, third week. The lung CT images initially may be of peripheral mild ground GGOs, and as you see 3 weeks later, they may have progressed to fibrotic changes in that same areas of GGO. So these are the patients which we are worried about. So first thing which comes to mind logically, illogically, ever in all sorts of inflammation is corticosteroids. So this recovery trial showed that probably made a real difference in the way we looked at these patients of dexamethasone in acute phase. It's definitely shown to improve outcomes in sick patients. This suggests that corticosteroid may be used in follow-up. There are no clear evidences, no RC2. Anecdotally, 4-week weaning regimen with prednisolone associated with accelerated resolutions. This is what has been described in one of the articles published in JAMA. Inflammatory post-COVID ILD, ground glass opacification with foci of organizing pneumonia. If you find this type of picture in the 3rd week, you have patients which have persistent respiratory symptoms and patients who have impairment of lung function. So in these patients, probably you can use these corticosteroids for a longer aspect. So this is one of our patients where on this, when we discharge this patient on day 20, again, I'm showing you these patients who are much earlier in the time frame. So I wanted to bring them because that was the time we were, so this patient, while even on 26 days, still has some GGOs along with the interlobus the interseptal thickening. So in this patient, we discharged this patient on corticosteroids. Obviously, there was no talk of antifibrotics. But if you see, a lot of these GGOs have resolved, few fibrotic bands are still there. So these low-dose steroids was something which we used out of probably a gut feeling than any data at that time. So I'm just showing you these cases in June. So one crucial feature was that is its duration, particularly in patients, because if you these patients who have persistence of GGOs, if you give extended corticosteroids, which is recommended only in select cases, the problem may be that it may be a double-edged sword, because it may also lead to more infections. It may lead to myopathy, which leads to more problems in post-COVID sequelae. The one rationale, as I said, could be that although there is no evidence, is that probably it may prevent pulmonary fibrosis. So we are not very clear, and we have to really look at the risk-benefit ratio individually when we are giving steroids. Obviously, watch against large doses of oral steroids, as it could worsen hyperglycemia and, as I said, create proximal myopathy, which may in terms prevent the patient's mobility and rehabilitation. In various studies, maximum which has been given at discharge is around 20 to 30 milligram of prednisolone, and then tapered as looking at patients' clinical response. Steroids, obviously, this is a very nice article which has just come out. It's an editorial which says we need a precision approach, not one size fits all. But that's, I think, very true in most of the patient places where we use steroids. So more or less, the data is in these specific patients of specific cohorts is there. The benefit of corticosteroids has not been established in those over 70 years of age. Hyperglycemia is a definite risk, and longer outcomes, more than 28 days, were required to properly assess. So I think this article just summarizes that we have to be very, very clear and probably have a sort of precision medicine approach or a customized approach to that particular patient of COVID. Before I move further to other aspects, I'd like to immediately come down to something which has been in news of late, because lung transplant is being done even in India. So this was on June 12th, where the Northwestern Memorial Hospital in Chicago announced that they have successfully done a double lung transplant in a woman in 20s. It's Dr. Ankin Bharat, who is the chief of thoracic surgery there. And he finally published this paper just around 15 days back in Science Translational Medicine on the lung transplantation for patients with severe COVID. So he published results of 3 patients which he has done. And the important thing to look from these aspects is that these patients spend more than 3 months in their ICUs. They had marked disruption of matrix organization in tissue cleared lung sections, as severe as you see explants from patients with pulmonary fibrosis. So almost the findings were very, very similar to something like pulmonary fibrosis. They observed remarkable similarities in single cell transcriptomes from lung explants from patients with COVID and those with pulmonary fibrosis, including this aberrant KRT17 staining, which positive epithelial cells are there in areas of fibrosis. So what I wanted to bring home by discussing transplant at this point was that they found that a lot of these patients where they actually went ahead and required a transplant, those lungs actually were very similar to the lungs when they actually explant from the pulmonary fibrosis patients. So this is something which probably is a first-hand proof that, okay, the fibrosis is one of the reasons that these patients were not getting off ventilators or not getting out. So probably therein lies the rationale for maybe discussing an antifibrotic therapy, which is probably, I would say, more in vogue, with more probably heart than mind. I think we still do not, the last word hasn't been said, but the amount of prescriptions which have been given for post-COVID fibrosis definitely outscore whatever we have used probably in past few years, even in established UIPs and fibrotic ILDs. So fibrosis associated with organizing pneumonia to severe acute lung injury may lead to rapid evolution towards fibrotic change. It may be a consequence of cytokine storm. And as I said, there are definite features which are very similar to IPF in post-COVID fibrosis. So this is one of our patients who on discharge on day 23 of illness had few areas of remnant of GGOs, but fibrosis was setting in, and in the basal areas there was fibrosis and interlobular septal thickening. So we put this patient on, and patient was requiring almost 3 to 4 liters of oxygen, which we were not able to take out. We started this patient on antifibrotics, and you will see that after 3 weeks, there is improvement in the CT scan. So I am not very sure how much is it because of the the drugs, how much is because of self-resolution, how much is it the natural course. Now, that is still something, but one thing is for sure that after 12 weeks, this patient definitely had reduction in the requirement of oxygen. Patient could walk up to the toilet without oxygen, and gradually patient was feeling better. So I think these are just our personal experiences which we are seeing from patients. Well, there are recent clinical trials for COVID-19 associated pulmonary fibrosis. Many drugs have been used, and the commoner ones are nintedanib and pirfenidone. Both are available, and with the removal of the because nintedanib till October was, since it was a patented drug, extremely expensive, and since a lot of our Indian pharmaceutical companies, including Zydus, have come up, we have realized that because of the reduction in the price, I think there has been, right or wrongly, a tendency to use this drug right, left, top, center. I think that's something which we probably have to weigh the risks and the pros and cons of each drug before we look at. So obviously the potential mechanisms which the novel antifibrotic drugs could prevent development are similar because the SARS-CoV-2 binds to ACE2. We have looked at the pathophysiology and the way these drugs actually act in other cases of fibrosis. They would tend to, they theoretically should be helpful in things. The duration is not to, we do not know. Obviously, we can take up or extrapolate from the impulses and inbuilt trials of nintedanib, where the early improvement FVC was not seen before 4 to 6 weeks. So definitely, you do not expect the results of this therapy to come anywhere before 4 to 6 weeks. So this is something, if you are trying it as a clinical trial or as a probably because you have nothing left. So you have to understand that you are not going to get the results before 4 to 6 weeks. The ASCENT trial of pirfenidone was, again, the results were seen after 3 months. So at least 3 months drug should be given before you can evaluate the response. The inhibition of IL-1 has the potential to prevent the development of post-COVID pulmonary fibrosis, at least theoretically. So both of them have a biological rationale for use in COVID-associated fibrosis. The application of this knowledge will depend on the rapidity of action of this, which we do not know, when to initiate, and these are questions which we will take up towards the end. And this is another patient of ours who, after 6 weeks, because he had very little bit of fibrosis, but definitely fibrosis in both the lungs. But after 6 weeks, you will see that gradually the patient has had a self-resolution without. So I've shown you 3 different aspects where we used steroids, we used antifibrotics, and we did nothing. And this patient had also improved. So this was a patient who did not require oxygen at the first course. So obviously we didn't go ahead with any of this, and patient improved. This is a case report published very recently in Lung India from Dr. Duvadia's group in Hinduja Hospital, Mumbai. And it showed that this was a patient who was given everything, including tocilizumab and remdesivir and everything. The GGOs were replaced by fibrosis. The patient was already on steroids. And despite this, did not improve and finally was discharged on antifibrotics, oxygen support, and steroids. So there may be some value in probably rationale of using a combination therapy in patients where you see both inflammatory and fibrotic limbs of cascades need to be addressed. So that much about the 2 main aspects of therapy, but there are other supportive things. Obviously, oxygen is going to be one of the important things in a lot of these patients in home care. Patients may require support for the ILDs. The pulmonary rehab, again, is a very, very vital importance, and I would really love to hear from our colleagues from All India Institute, Rishikesh and Delhi, because I believe they do a lot of pulmonary rehab work and how the patients are improving with COVID-19. And I think there is a very nice paper, again, published just 15 days back from Stefano Nava's group on preparing for the phase 3. So they are now calling for these patients who are post-COVID sequelae, how much pulmonary rehabilitation can actually help. Anticoagulation, again, is a very, very important aspect. A lot of questions people ask that should these patients of post-COVID fibrosis all should be given the anticoagulation at the time of discharge, because they are definitely maybe at risk of getting a pulmonary embolism, and any hypoxic insult could be a major setback in these. But yes, if they are not mobile, if there is muscle wasting, patients are breathless, I think the anticoagulation should be continued, but the overall risk-benefit ratio should be assessed prior to discharge, which cannot be overemphasized because of the risk involved. All patients should receive vaccinations, definitely, against influenza and pneumonia. Obviously, at least you can prevent as much as possible from the super added infections in the post-COVID state. Nutrition, again, is something which is something very, very least emphasized. I think it's not a cure, but because the overall immune system and the immunometabolism, these are modifiable contributors to any chronic disease. So I think looking at a good nutrition and probably devising a plan for especially for the elderlies and patients with pre-existing conditions can be a very, very important aspect as we treat these patients of post-COVID fibrosis. I've already discussed about the part of lung transplant already. And if you look at the overall aspects of whatever has been tried, you would see that drugs from spironolactones to Chinese medicines to plasminogen activators to TPAs and urokinases and hyperbaric oxygens, all these have been tried in patients of pulmonary fibrosis. So what's my take on it? Before I probably take a couple of few more slides to discuss one more aspect. I think if the patient has subtle fibrosis, young asymptomatic patient, which may resolve with time, I think just leave it and wait and watch. Patient has subtle fibrosis in symptomatic patients need an observation. Sachin, I think we'll need to mute people, and somebody has put something on the drawn something that need to. So second part would be patients who are subtle fibrosis and symptomatic patients will need an observation. If dyspnea is out of proportion to fibrosis, other causes need to be ruled out like pulmonary thromboembolism, pulmonary hypertension, or any other underlying cardiac dysfunction. If abnormalities are predominantly organizing type or NSIP type on CTs, maybe oral steroids may be helpful. The duration and dose can only be clinically decided and risks and benefit weighed. And finally, if you have more traction bronchiectasis or bronchiolectasis, reticular shadows, interstitial thickening, alveolar collapse like UIP, IPF pattern, I think maybe antifibrotics can be tried after explaining to the attendants the need for same. Is it progressive or reversible? Well, long-term, as I showed you, that long-term data of SARS said it was better, but unfortunately, this data shows that even after 15 years, almost 38% will have reduced diffusion capacity. So you will have few patients who, unfortunately, despite therapies, would probably behave like IPFs and will be a burden. There will be an increased burden of respiratory issues on the healthcare facilities. Can we look at the progression of disease on PFT? Well, patients who had more PFT abnormalities were one who had more acute COVID, was severe, which had high level of inflammatory markers and had evidence of pulmonary fibrosis on CT scan very early. So this is from Dr. Ganesh Raghu's article, which was published recently. CT scans unveil persisting lung pathology in 63%, but in this particular, as I said, this has just come yesterday night. So ahead of print, sequential follow-up of evaluations at 60 and 100 days actually showed vast improvement in both symptoms and CT scan abnormality. So that is very heartening. And there will be a good subset of patients which will, after 3 to 6 months, probably would be improving on their own. So natural history of COVID would be improving, most common. Static, less common, and the least common would be progressive. But we are bothered for this particular group of patients, although it is least common, but once you have progressive post-COVID fibrosis, I think that is something which we are bothered about and we are discussing today. Any post-COVID fibrosis related complication? Well, pneumomediastinum has been described more than we have already seen anywhere. Infections like fungal, CMV, tuberculosis reactivations, and new TB infections have been definitely described in this post-COVID state, patients with post-COVID fibrosis and post-COVID sequelae. So what probably it requires is that now we sit back and think about an integrated multidisciplinary model of COVID-19 recovery. We have been discussing about the acute care and making pathways of where to go for COVID care, COVID health centers, and COVID hospitals. I think now the time has come that we will have to, because the burden is going to be there on healthcare, we have to look at the integrated multidisciplinary model of COVID-19 recovery care. There are beautiful articles. I'll not discuss this, and I think we will discuss this with the panel. I'll just leave it at that time, and required we'll come back to these slides because they are now algorithms drawn. These are from Peter George's study from UK. But I think we will have to make our own ways of looking at these patients, and so suggested follow-ups of COVID survivors has been described up to say 1 year. And unfortunately, some people of COVID-19 fibrosis may not be very lucky. And as this is one of our patients, despite everything, patient has bad lungs, and unfortunately, we couldn't send this patient home. Many months back, as I was telling, I took a talk with Girish. So I was calling this as COVID-19. Is it a fast track IPF? That a lot of these patients have suddenly had these honeycombing so fast in 3 weeks to 6 weeks, where we never seen any disease actually leading to such fast honeycombing developing on CT scans. And almost at that time, there were a couple of papers which came almost looking at what I called as fast track IPF. They called that rapidly progressive organizing pneumonia and also causing a rapid onset honeycombing fibrosis in spontaneously breathing patients. So this has just come up a month back. So this is something now which is getting described more and more. Extensive honeycombing associated with septal thickening and subpleural predominance even on day 10. So as early as day 10, this has been described in this particular patient. So this is very, very stressing, because if the patients day 10, you are not expecting patients to be actually going into a bad, fast honeycombing. Why, we do not know. So as I wind up, so should we call it as reversible or progressive? Long-term consequences remain speculated and should not be assumed without appropriate prospective study. There is no definite criteria and very scant data even as of now. So we just need to monitor these patients. Probably each patient will have to be individualized, and probably the customized medicine practiced in these patients. Factors which may be involved: the immune profile, maybe chances of immune dysregulation, severity and need for mechanical ventilation when they were sick, use of early corticosteroids, usage of immunosuppressants in early acute phase, and the pattern of ILD. Probably if you have a honeycombing type of pattern, they're more likely to be progressive than an NSIP type of pattern in those patients. Can we gain something from these patients? Because these patients who have probably GGOs, and we expect now that these patients are going to go into fibrosis. So can we actually look at this aspect as a sort of a point from where we can actually see that can we use antifibrotics early and prevent fibrosis? Because a lot of times we have used these drugs only to treat lung fibrosis, to halt the fibrotic progression. But we have never found a point of time where we know that early intervention can prevent those particular fibrosis. So probably this gives us a sort of a new research area where we can find out that, because we know that when the damage happened. So at what point do we start antifibrotics is a question which I think research would definitely answer. Maybe intervening early, maybe in certain particular individuals may be of benefit. I published this paper a couple of years back with Professor Subodh Verma on metformin and IPF. And this was published in Cell Metabolism. And I think more and more there are papers now coming up of use of metformin, because it acts via AMPK to reconstitute the metabolic homeostasis and repair fibrotic myofibroblasts. This may be another era of using these, repurposing these drugs in post-COVID fibrosis. There are a huge number of trials and multiple therapies which are being tried, not only in COVID, but in post-COVID also. And I think a lot of them will have their own pros and cons. But obviously, we have a couple of them, nintedanib and pirfenidone, which is available. So I think I will just stop here. And I think I've been more or less in, we have maybe another 20-25 minutes where we can discuss these things. So can we have all the panelists unmute themselves? Anand?
Yeah.
So I think you can begin anything, and then we will start with the questions which have already come up. There are a few questions on the chat box, but if this is whatever I could find from the available data. So your take on it, anything you want to comment, want to add, and then we begin to specificities.
So actually, actually, I think it was a very, very nice overview of the whole problem, the problem of post-COVID fibrosis or sequelae, pulmonary sequelae, let's call it post-COVID pulmonary sequelae. Now, some people are, maybe we were thinking of how to coin this as a disease. Maybe we can call it as a post-COVID lung disease or a post-COVID pulmonary disease. So these all things will come later on. And like you have said, there are more questions than answers to this as of now, because the post-COVID thing has come just last 3-4 months. We have data up to 2 months, 3 months or so, but again, that is too short a time to judge the effect of various therapies and interventions as of now. So what everybody is doing, like you said, is based on their personal experiences, trying out things. We also do the same. We usually have more or less the same approach, in the sense severe patients, they go home on a prolonged course of steroids probably, and if sometimes on oxygen therapy, on continuation of anticoagulation. The more milder cases, of course, don't need anything. The moderate cases and those who have some subtle symptoms at the time of discharge, they are the ones who need to be actually picked up early. Because the mild and the moderate cases are the one who need to be picked up for further long-term sequelae. So what we are trying to do is to try and follow them up whatever we can over a period of sequentially over a period of months and maybe later to years, and trying to look at the symptoms again, like you have shown a couple of very nice papers, how the symptoms persisted beyond discharge. Same thing we have to see. We are not sure about the antifibrotics as of now. Again, we also feel that fibrosis may resolve in a large majority over a period of time. We don't believe that antifibrotics should be given too early. That is not the right approach, and I think that message should not really go. People do argue that giving antifibrotics, people have given antifibrotics upfront, even during the time of admission. They have started steroid and antifibrotics. So probably from my side, my perspective, we should kind of discourage this practice actually. And just because something is available doesn't mean always it should be used immediately. We don't know whether it helps, but it may cause problems. And I think steroids, anticoagulation, and oxygen are still the mainstay of therapy for this disease. And close follow-up has to be done. Just one point about pulmonary rehab, you did mention that again we find important, and we are also doing the same as probably many other centers, trying to inbuild the pulmonary rehabilitation program, whatever is possible, to the patients on their subsequent follow-ups. And although we are not conducting any structured study for this, but we'll maybe in the next 3-4 months, we'll get some idea of whether it benefits or not. So I think it overall a very useful lecture for all of us to know the latest. And over the next couple of months, probably we'll have more and more insights.
Okay, so what I'll do is we will start with the questions which have come from the audience, right? And anybody can take them, or I will just randomly ask one of you. So I think one of the questions is from Professor Ashutosh Sachdev from University of Maryland. So we have people logged in from abroad also, from outside India also. So Professor Sachdev wants to ask that how are you managing prevention of second hit in these patients? Example, silent aspiration, secondary infections causing another injury, especially in patients on high dose steroids, and etc. There appears to be an overuse of steroids based on skewed sample of clinical consultations I have done for patients in India. So maybe some teleconsults opinions he has done. So his idea is that maybe we are overusing steroids post discharge, and the people are getting a lot of secondary infections. So Girish, would you like to take that?
Yeah. As the question is like, what to do for the steroid-related complications, right?
Yeah, basically,
So,
yeah.
That goes with every case, that one size doesn't fit all. So we need to be very judicious about using steroids. It has to be like with the persistent inflammation, we use steroids for long term, not in every case. So we can take guidance from the biomarkers like CRP, LDH, and even D-dimer. So when we
Correct.
find these persistently high inflammatory markers, then we should consider persistent or chronic use of steroids rather than just using them as a anti-fibrotic or anti-preventing fibrosis kind of thing.
Right.
So definitely
Yeah.
the steroids are
Yeah,
definitely
Prince wants to.
yes.
Yeah, Bharat, means a very nice and comprehensive coverage. I'll just for this question, I'll just add on. So suppose somebody has, we are very selective in that. So organizing pneumonia kind of picture, or that ground glassing there, those patients are going on steroids, but it still means we remain at not too much high dose steroid, very close follow up. And very close follow-up means within 15 days or 4 weeks, 6 weeks, we follow up and try to come down and see how patient is doing. So I fully agree with Dr. Girish and you that we should be very, very cautious about it, because secondary infection is another thing which can further cause the damage, and if we should be conscious about it.
So I think right from since we are discussing steroids, so I'd like uh, Samir, if you will take that any role of pulse therapy of, see, we use dexamethasone like a blanket therapy now in patients of moderate to severe illnesses, patients who are not on ventilator as per the guidelines. Now, these patients who go into the third week still requiring high dose oxygen, maybe going into fibrosis, you can't shift them for getting CT scans, right? Because they're on high flow oxygen or on NIV at 100%. So any role of giving high dose methylprednisolone pulse therapy, say 1 gram for 3 days.
So Bharat, this is a very tricky question, and it's a tricky scenario where you want to, the patient has come with CT changes and requiring oxygen. And so more than dexamethasone, I think all of us have been very comfortable using methylprednisolone for a number of years in all our pulmonary cases. So yes, we have used pulse therapy, as well as we have used divided doses, like something like 80 milligram twice or 40 milligram twice, that kind of a therapy in patients, despite of that paper of dexamethasone that got published. And of course, about the previous discussion about steroid, what Dr. Ashutosh brought out was a very important point. There are two aspects here. Number one has to really taper the steroids quickly, and we cannot prolong them in very high doses, like probably was done in CT ILDs or other type of our ILDs. And we should go back to something like 5 mg every day or 5 mg alternate day as quickly as possible from the time of discharge. And we need to cover them with antibiotics, maybe at times even with antifungal if a patient is a diabetic, and we need to do their blood culture or urine culture to pinpoint why there is fever. Another aspect I wanted to point out was many times this fever, even if, when their markers are coming down, the patient, once the doses of steroid are coming down, they can complain of fever. I personally feel that, now this is just an observation, there are many parallels between COVID-19 and tuberculosis. Like our TB patients have fever for say 2 or 3 weeks despite of starting anti-TB treatment, many a times COVID patients are having fever. Another observation is those who have fever to begin with. Suppose somebody started with fever and diagnosed COVID positive RT-PCR and has fever for 12, 14, 15 days. I'm sure all of us have seen such kind of cases where fever has prolonged despite of giving the cocktail of medications. It is just the inflammatory reaction. And such people, somehow they have not landed in cytokine storm, is my observation. I may be totally wrong. I'm sure you must have seen people who have had longer duration of fever and maybe have landed up in cytokine storm, but this is what I have peculiarly seen. Similarly, you treated a moderate to severe case of COVID in ICU with maybe NIV, and you gave all the treatment as per your protocol. And then at the time of your discharge, you have put that patient on steroid. The moment you start tapering steroid, sometimes they come back with complaint of fever, which is generally not more than 99 or not more than 99.5 degree Fahrenheit. So I personally feel that if the inflammatory markers are coming down, if procalcitonin is normal, then probably it is just that inflammation in the body which is giving rise to fever. So we can simply treat them with paracetamol and keep a check on their oxygenation. That is what matters. And the second input I wanted to give here was, when do you think about steroid or when do you think about antifibrotics? On admission or during the admission, if somebody's CT scan is showing crazy paving, again, it's an observation. Maybe not when somebody is just having ground glassing, but somebody who is having crazy paving or already starts showing intralobular septal thickening, or there are subpleural parenchymal bands, which is quite common in these patients. That is the time one should think of giving either pulse steroid and of course thinking of adding novel anticoagulants at that particular stage, because that goes in a long way to prevent further fibrosis. Has been an observation, but again, it's just an observation, obviously not authenticated by any trials.
So Prince, I think I'll just request everyone to be short so that we can take, there are lots of questions.
Yeah. No. Bharat and Dr. Samir, just want to know this pulse, no? As Dr. Anant also wrote, is methylpredose is around 32 or something, no? Or it is are we giving 1 gram?
No, people. The question is that
it is a low dose
question because there are papers to show that more than 250 milligram of pulse therapy into 3 days versus standard of care, which is equivalent dose of 6 milligrams. Dexa is 32 milligram. So they tried that, and they some papers have shown that pulse therapy of 250 milligram per day into 3 days, more than 250, 500, 1 gram, they have used in different group, has done better as compared to their arm. But those sample sizes like 10 to 15 patients on each side. So there is a question from the audience that can we use pulse not only for the question is not only for that active phase, but also for once the patient is not coming off oxygen and is going into a persistently high oxygen requirement. So that is the question which they want, right? So I think the what Samir has said, probably the data is not very clear as of now, especially in the use of steroids on almost in the 3rd week. And as we said that, as you also said, probably if you're having a CT which can guide you or markers which can guide you for ongoing high hyperimmune phenomena or high inflammatory state, probably you can add on to steroid. But I still don't think, even I don't think that 1 gram into 3 days type of scenario of pulsing for in the 3rd week when you have fibrosis, I don't know how much help it could do. So what I'll do is I'm tried, as you guys were discussing, I've just noted down the question and I'll just ask questions as per the heading. So I think Anand, there is a question on diagnosis that in these patients, once you have, suppose you don't do anything and 4th to 6th week, these patients have these ILD type of picture. Do you advocate use of transbronchial lung biopsy and look at the pathology before deciding should we give antifibrotics or you don't give, if the CT scan has mixed picture of UIP and SIP mixed type of pattern?
No, in practice, we don't really advocate, and obviously we have not done it also. See, technically, sometimes it may make sense to try and go inside and take a tissue in those very difficult or overlapping radiological picture where you don't know, whether you have to give this or that. What we just try to keep it simple. We do CT scans whenever it is indicated or whenever there is worsening. If there is ground glass, we continue steroids. If there is no ground glass, we don't give steroids. If we have given a reasonable time beyond improvement, that is at least 3 months of time, still the patient is symptomatic, hypoxic, or fibrosis is increasing, then probably a case comes to initiate or start with antifibrotics. Otherwise, because we have seen most of the patients have interstitial fibrosis early, most of that resolves by 2 to 3 months. So I'm not really sure whether it makes sense to give antifibrotics as soon as the patient gets discharged, just because he has some fibrosis initially.
I think I will have to take that balanced view, as you are saying, before deciding for these patients. So, but I think from the discussion, one thing is sure, that if you have a patient who is requiring high dose of oxygen and still has a lot of GGOs on CT. And so I think continuing with an appropriate dose of steroids is not a bad idea. Obviously, you will have to look at the aspects of secondary infection, something. From that, there is another question that do you add empirical antifungals in these patients of post-COVID fibrosis? Any data? Suppose your galactomannan, people are doing galactomannans and then adding voriconazole. People, I've had the many cross consults from our colleagues where people have added anandrolfungin with no particular. So obviously, I personally, my take is I don't think that will have any empirical therapy would have any value in these patients. So, Anant, we will ask you and then move to the next.
No, quickly in brief, no, we don't. And I think then these would be an overkill. If we try to start giving everything upfront in every patient in the hope that something might work.
Will work. So
I think that is not the real art of medicine. I would say one should take, of course, one should go by case to case basis.
Yeah, that's what because a lot of cases been having empirical therapies for this, like blanket therapy. You give third week, you give antifungals. So I think so. Girish, can I see there are questions? I'll just club those questions. There, people are asking role of stat. This is with regards to post-COVID sequelae. So the questions are role of statins, role of thalidomide, role of colchicine, role of doxycycline. So I've added all because for me the answer is I don't know or no. What is your take?
So basically, people are trying to think that the persistent inflammation can be treated by other anti-inflammatory drugs other than steroids. That is the idea why people are asking these questions. So the steroids had worked so far fine, and we don't know the answer yet to, as we were discussing, like dexamethasone versus methylprednisolone or low dose or high. Have some data. Dexamethasone 6 milligram in recovery trial works fine for even severe cases, and then one study from Iran is showing that methylprednisolone pulse also works fine.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying.
I think no study has shown any other inflammatory marker being tested for these patients. I don't think so.
Great. I think for the people who are putting questions in the chat, see, case scenarios will be very difficult because somebody is asking, I'm giving 14 days of this. What should I do now? I think those things will be very difficult to discuss as of now. So let's stick to broad things. So there is another question of use of immunomodulators in post-COVID sequelae. There are a lot of things in the market like Sepsivax and thymotrypsin alphas, and I don't even know. So a lot of things. So any experience people are asking. Prince.
So we have used it. Yeah. Okay. Prince.
You can ask.
I wish we know, but the answer is I think right now we do not know, and any of these things are working. So things are coming up, and people are trying.
So we have tried to use.
I think we'll wait for the.
It's okay.
Yeah, Dr. Girish, please carry on.
Yeah, so we have tried to use thymosin alpha in some 3-4 patients with the persistent oxygen requirement and on ventilation, but it didn't work in these 3-4 cases. But this is very small number to say anything.
So okay, at least you have tried, so you can whatever little experience you have from use, people can benefit from that. So they should not be overboard by the things like Anant was saying, that using everything at this it's becoming like a cocktail therapy, and everything is being tried in these patients because we do not know what is going to happen. I think what I tell my attendants of those patients is that number one thing is patience. You will have to be patient, because even we will have to be patient as doctors. So that urge of doing something has to be controlled. That is what I feel, because a lot of time you see our patients, they're not improving every day in the morning rounds. So there's an urge which you feel that I should do something. Maybe add this, maybe this would work. And that is probably confusing the whole issue in a lot of cases. Right. Okay. The next question is, and a very important question, mainly Anant, you can take that. Have you and maybe all the medical colleges and institutes have started with post-COVID clinics? So in short, what is it about? How are you planning to do it?
So post-COVID clinics are now coming up. I'm not sure about every medical college, but some of them definitely are.
At AIIMS
Depending upon,
Delhi?
yeah, we are, but it is not like a post-COVID clinic, a comprehensive, which is doing each and every evaluation of every system. That is too tedious and logistically it is very difficult. As it is, we are all stretched for manpower, and to depute more manpower for this post-COVID clinic is becoming a challenge. But in our department, yes, we are doing the respiratory part at our level with whatever manpower we have. So trying to contact them either on phone or by physical visits and try to see at least the symptom analysis and basic respiratory functions and keep them under a follow-up. That is our aim as of now. So that part, yes.
Very. Girish, would you like to add something on the rehabilitation? Because I came across one of a very beautiful booklet from your department on pulmonary rehabilitation and
Yes, yes,
post-COVID.
yes. So we are
So that
working
was
on
very
it.
wonderful. Yeah. So
Yeah,
maybe
we
you
are
can give
working on it.
your.
We have alerted our pulmonary rehabilitation team that we are going to get patients with post-COVID fibrosis and sequelae. So be prepared for involving these kind of patients. So they are making their strategies and how they will entertain these kind of patients with PPE and what kind of instrumentation or they can go through. So they are working on it. Yes, we have alerted them, and this is definitely going to be the need of the hour soon. We
Great.
have
Thank you.
enrolled actually 3 patients to
And
rehabilitation so far.
Samir, you would like to have a comment on from the private practice aspect, because I find it very, very difficult now to probably get a post-COVID rehab work running in a hospital which is full of COVID and non-COVID patients. So it's becoming very tough. So what is your take? Because Bombay is slightly settling down.
Correct.
So what are you guys doing there?
So a couple of hospitals here have started post-COVID clinics. But frankly, in my private setup and in my own OPD in those hospitals, I'm anyway counseling those patients. And I have already roped in a couple of physiotherapists and nutritionists. And then also at times I take help of a psychologist or a psychiatrist, because many a times those people who have recovered and coming with breathlessness, they're actually their lungs have recovered, but the breathlessness is more psychological and they require that kind of counseling. So yes, independently we are working in tandem with nutritionists, physiotherapists, psychologists, etc. But I have not started a post-COVID clinic per se.
Right. So I think one question from Dr. Paras Gangwal, who's the senior physician in East Delhi. Well, this is more to do with, and I think Anant, we need to clear this because again and again this is coming, that post-COVID, severe COVID patient who is getting discharged, they are asking, is this steroid necessary versus the mild cases which are getting discharged, and duration / dose. And the second, almost to that, is giving NOAC, any particular NOAC versus the other. So I think let's probably have a one-line answer to this, and because this is probably something which we now have discussed, and again the question is coming, so probably you are the best person to answer this.
I think most of this is there if they read the national guidelines on the website of the health ministry and the family welfare ministry. All this has been addressed there. Firstly, as far as the steroid is concerned, usually it is given to 7 to 10 days, as you all know, and at the time of discharge, more often than not, we are able to stop it. In mild cases, there is obviously no need to give steroids. In moderate cases, by the time they discharge, one is able to stop it, or at the most give it for 3 to 4 days and then finish off. It is in the severe cases who most of them will have extensive disease. Again, most of them will have had a CT scan done. If at the time of discharge it is showing persistent activity in the form of persistent GGO, then yes, one should go ahead and give a course of steroids again. And one need not keep on doing a CT again and again. Go with the oxygenation, go with the clinical response, and decide when to stop the steroids after that. So that may be 1 week, 2 weeks, even 3 weeks. So with monitoring of sugars, one can give these steroids in the particular dose. We do it for sarcoidosis, we do it for months. So I think the fear of steroid toxicity to me seems to be a little overhyped by some people. If it is required, it is required, and it has to be given with close monitoring as we do for many other diseases. I think it will
Correct.
not really make a difference. The second question was about the
Or
newer and oral
newer
anticoagulants.
anticoagulants.
Again, to that, it all depends upon the condition at admission and at discharge. If he was if he was critically ill, if there is a pulmonary thromboembolism, then there is no doubt about it. Then you have to give it. Otherwise, if it is was not, then actually there is no recommendation for giving a continuation of antithrombotic therapy beyond discharge, unless there are risk factors like he's unable to walk. Suppose he's likely to be bedridden at home. If he's so risk factors at home, if they are going to be there, then we continue. Otherwise, not.
So I think what I understand is these decisions are nothing different from what we would have taken. It was another illness, right?
Yeah, absolutely,
So these are
absolutely.
the same. So I think there is nothing different about a COVID patient going home or another sepsis patient going home. Probably these decisions would have been taken similarly. I think probably that's the gist of what I understand. Am I right?
Absolutely, absolutely.
Right. So tell me one thing. I think you have been very kind enough, Anand, to be answering a lot of the questions directly on the chat box. There is an interesting thing which you answered about radiotherapy. So I just thought, because I've been trying to even look at the chat along with listening to you guys. So just in one line, just can you tell about, because you did some trial on radiotherapy use in COVID?
Yeah, that was basically initiated by the radiotherapy department and their HOD, Dr. D.N. Sharma. So they did a small trial in moderate COVID pneumonia and going for radiotherapy in that. I don't know the exact details, but whatever verbal discussion I had with him was that it was initial reports are encouraging. But I'm not really in a position to recommend this or say that it is really going to work in the long run. We'll wait for the final manuscript to come out and then give that kind of a decision. But work is going on in this. So let's see what happens. They have their own concept that radiotherapy kind of decreases the ground glassing, and also they have their own concept of very low dose. It's a very low dose radiotherapy actually. So we'll have to wait and see in a couple of weeks what comes out.
Right. So what I'll do is, I think maybe another 5 minutes will close. So I'll just show you a couple of cases, have your word on probably these are sample cases which we would have seen even I don't. See, this is a patient who is, if you look at the CT, this is a patient with this type of picture with a lot of fibrosis. Now he's come to us for follow-up after 8 weeks, said still requiring 2 liters of oxygen, 2 to 3 liters. So steroids are now at 4 milligrams of methylprednisolone. You think we should add antifibrotics at this stage? Or still wait? It's 8 weeks now post discharge. So probably the total duration of illness is like 12 weeks.
Bharat, I'm not able to see your CT scan. Are you sharing?
Sorry, I think who is Anand? Can you see the?
I can see it. I can
Bharat,
see.
we can see.
Yeah.
Bharat,
So
any
then,
resolution from the start of the illness?
yeah, this is resolved, and only these fibrotic changes are now left. Obviously, the initial CT was full of GGOs and everything. So what I'm saying, it's a hypothetical. Do you add antifibrotics at this stage or not? Because now these next 2-3 in quickly, we just want to make it clear that what I wanted to bring home the point is that if a patient is still 1 liters or some child has put everything over my CT scan, I'm so sorry. It's not my child. Sachin, can you reverse this? Yeah, right. Somebody has reversed. Thank you. Whoever.
I can see it. Can you run the scan again, please?
Yeah, I will. So it's more of a hypothetical situation I just picked up. So to bring home the point that even in these patients who are, can you see Sameer now?
Yes, I can see it very well. Yeah.
So these are basically fibrotic changes which are left after 12 weeks of total illness. So just quickly from each, Anand, will you start antifibrotics or wait? 2 liters of oxygen still required.
So everything will depend. Is he improving?
Yeah, he is improving, but now he has become stagnant at 2 liters of oxygen. We can't take him off oxygen at this time, even at rest.
So if the improvement has stopped and if he's no longer further improving from the last couple of weeks, then probably one would initiate antifibrotics because already 3 months have passed from the onset of illness.
That's exactly what I said. But probably this is the time where we'll have to take that call, looking at the individual patient as such. So we cannot give you a blanket take-home point about use of antifibrotics. So that was the point which I needed to bring. No, even So this is another
He's
patient,
going
almost.
to-
Hello.
Hello. So another patient who has these persistent changes even after, this is a much less time. So this is around 6 weeks after follow-up. So this patient, I think, is on steroids, around 6 milligrams of methylprednisolone, and oxygen requirement has actually gone to practically negligible. It's only that he desaturates a little bit on room air. So should we continue steroid or add something else? Prince?
I think
Girish,
he's
you can answer.
improving and the
I'm
oxygen
sorry, I can't
requirement
see the
has come
screen.
down.
Yeah. So we continue with steroids as of now?
He's improving,
That
and
will-
since
yeah.
he's better now, maybe we
Yeah,
can.
but he still
use this-
desaturates on walking up to the toilet. But at rest, the oxygen is fine. It's around 94%.
Yeah.
So should we continue steroids at 6
but-
weeks post illness?
He's improving. I mean, as we said.
Yeah. So should we continue steroids or think about something else? Girish?
Yeah, so this patient, as I could see, there is some ground glassing along
Yeah,
with
correct.
some air tapping in many areas. So maybe there is some, COPD component also there. So that we can add some bronchodilators and inhaled steroids to assist.
The
Maybe we can wait.
idea is that we can wait with the steroid. We can continue with the steroid at this time.
Yes.
Okay. So I think the important thing to just highlight was that COVID-19 is a unique and novel infection that has already demonstrated a range of perplexing clinical syndromes. And unfortunately, its legacy will be felt long after the pandemic has passed. It is vital that respiratory community is now primed, and that was the whole aim of doing this meeting and sharing your experiences, answering few questions. And we are sorry we cannot take every question. We are already ahead of the time, and probably we have to be primed to manage few patients with long-term consequences of the infection. The burden would likely be increased. We may see patients would have a lot of impairment in their lung function testing. We may use antifibrotic therapies in future. We do not know when to start. As Anant rightly said right at the beginning, probably more or less we have more questions than we have answers at this time. Post-COVID fibrosis may open up an interesting area of research, I personally feel, where we can actually look in research-based setting, look at early intervention to prevent progression. So this is more of research-based setting, not take-home point for everyone. So when deciding whom to listen, this is a very nice editorial which came out in the BMJ. When deciding whom to listen to the COVID-19 era, that includes me, we should respect those who respect uncertainty and listen in particular to those who acknowledge conflicting evidence on even their most strongly held views, because it is changing so fast. And I think we do not know when and what is good. But ultimately, this is what we want. This is one of our patients which we continued, struggled with NIVs for over a month and a half in the hospital. And finally, his smile actually, although he went home on oxygen, but it's exactly this is what we want, don't we? This is what we want our patients finally to send them home through this disastrous illness which is there. Thank you so much. And as I finish, I request you to invite, it's a pleasure to invite you all. Next week, we'll be doing a seminar on robotics and bronchoscopy, something very different thing for the future. But I think it's good to learn things which probably are there, which are being used internationally, and I think we'll be using it soon. So I think I would request people to, if those who are interested, they can send their mail IDs. We'll send you the Zoom link, and we'll try to circulate it to as many people as possible. So as I end, a very big thanks to everyone who has been there, my all co-panelists who have been so helpful in answering all the questions, and you all have been really brilliant. And I am sorry that I took a little bit more time, but I think it was important that people around 350 people or 400 people who logged in probably went back with messaging, which was important. So thank you, Anand. Thank you, Girish. Thank you, Prince, and thank you, Samir. And also thank you to the Zydus team who have done the back-end work or the technical aspect, looking at setting up this platform and sending the invites. Thank you all, and I hope that you all stay safe. And I think we hope to meet in near future. I think those times are not far away where we can meet and have physical meetings soon. Thank you so much, and I wish you a very, very pleasant evening. Thank you.
Bharat, thanks a ton for conducting a fantastic session. Thanks
Thanks
a
a lot.
ton.
Thank you, Samir.
Thank you, Dr. Bharat.
Thank you, Girish.
Bye-bye.
Thank you so
Bye-bye.
much.
Bye.
Okay, bhai.
Thank you,
Chalo.
Anand. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Logging off now. Okay.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Sachin. Thank you, Rajiv.
Thank you, sir.
So I think I'm also logging off now.
Excuse me, sir. Hello.
Yeah.
Sir, this is Dr. Vijay Sabrai. Hello, sir.
You pardon?
Sir, Dr. Vijay speaking, sir.
Yeah.
Sir, previously it was thought to be that lung fibrosis cannot be reversed. It was that old
Yes.
era, but now it is now
Yes.
welcome, and this prevention of lung fibrosis is very important.
Hmm.
So after having, sir, after having fibrosis, do you comment on the prognosis of the chronic diseases having lung fibrosis?
So I think, Dr. Vijay, the whole idea,
yes, sir.
see, what you will understand is ultimately fibrosis in many cases is going to be a reparative phenomena. It's a repair phenomena which is occurring.
Correct,
And
sir.
a scar is going to be formed, right?
Sir, sir.
Now that it is how much repair occurs, as if you listen to the talk, it is depends on the endothelial dysfunction or the overall dysfunction of a body. So if
Sir.
the repair is in a correct way, nothing is going to happen. The scar will not be formed. But if
Yeah,
it goes
sir.
haywire, I think that is the point where the problems occur and leads to, especially in lung, these scars will lead to fibrosis and lead to problems. You are very right. There is no drug which has, I
Yes, sir.
brought this point out, that there is no drug which has been made to reverse fibrosis. They were all to slow the fibrosis. But that is what I said, that maybe in all those IPF patients, we were adding them at a stage where the fibrosis had already set in. It was
Sir.
probably beyond the point where it could come. And this disease opens up an era where we can actually do research in starting it probably at a particular point where we can actually look at how we can slow and reverse the fibrosis if possible. So I think this is something where the trials are going to take place and people are already looking into this aspect, right?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Thank you. Thank you very much, sir.
If anybody is there, I'm still here. So if anybody wants to ask any question, if something is still left, I'll try my best. Although I'm
Sir, in
thinking of
TB, the national burden of tuberculosis is very high, sir. So,
Yeah.
the chronic diseases of tuberculosis is sarcoidosis, sir. So, there is, I think, sir, a different scenario of the patient of the clinical presentation, sir. Sir, accordingly, sir, we are trying our best to save the patient. But, sir, is there any role of physiotherapy and exercise and all this?
Yeah. I think if you had attended, I am not sure if you attended the whole, as Dr. Girish from Rishikesh was saying, and Dr. Anand,
Definitely.
the pulmonary rehab has a definite role, right?
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Right, sir.
Okay, guys.
Thank you
Bye.
very much. Bye, sir.
Bye. Bye. Sachin,
sir.
can I log off?
Yes, sir. Thanks. Thanks, sir.
There is a question from people who are saying webinar link. I think whoever is still listening to us, we will send you the webinar link. We have recorded this whole meeting, and I hope it was useful for everyone. And we're going to send you. I hope. I think Sachin, you are noting down the email IDs of people who are. You can send them the links as soon as you have it.
Yes.
Right. So we'll try to send you the link, and you can probably listen to it once again at your own pace. Okay.
Bharat,
Brother is MD physician. He is also attending the meeting, sir. So hello, sir. I am a medical officer in government sector, sir, since 17 to 18 years, sir. My brother is MD physician working in Ahmednagar district, sir.
Right.
Sir, we have done very well our best in the both of us in COVID this illnesses, sir, to the people in our jurisdiction concerned, sir.
That's
so medical
brilliant.
officers are doing their best, sir, in prevention and this So thank you for arranging this webinar and giving your valuable information to.
And it's my pleasure, and thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Okay.
Thank you for
Bharat.
attending. Thank you.
Bharat,
Yes.
Bharat. Hello, Bharat.
Yeah, who is there? Anji,
Dr.
Dr.
Suresh Mittal.
Sir, namaste. Yes, sir.
ये जो Baricitinib है ना, it has been approved by
I
FDA.
know. I know. It's
हाँ,
a
तो ये
paper
तो-
has come out in NEJM where they have shown, but if you look at that paper, it just shows that a combination of remdesivir with this drug
Yeah,
leads
yeah, yeah.
to just 1 day early discharge or the shortening the illness by 1 day, 7 versus 8.
It's
There
not illness. It also prevent this pulmonary fibrosis.
It's very difficult to comment at this time unless you have this drug and follow up for at least, as Anant was saying, follow up for at least 3 to 6 months. So
This
so
drug
finally
is-
we will know. See, we will finally know, sir, once the data in a good subset is available.
This
Definitely,
drug is-
some drug or the other will be useful.
Then this drug is being used in rheumatoid arthritis, and it rheumatoid arthritis related fibrosis. It prevent rheumatoid arthritis fibrosis also. So it is a known fact.
So it definitely, I think it would be worth trying in research settings, because we used Actemra like this only in a lot of patients, and now I think the world has practically given up on Actemra.
That's
So
true.
I think so things will
It's a oral.
things will evolve.
It's a very
What I'm
simple
saying
and oral
is,
drug.
what I'm saying is, things are going to only evolve. So this data has just come out, and definitely, I think if I have a patient who probably fits into the bill, probably there's no harm in trying that.
Yes, it's a since
Right.
a oral drug you can give for 2
Yeah.
weeks.
So
That's the main thing.
thank you for bringing that up, sir. Thank you so much for attending.
Okay.
Okay, thank you, sir.
Yes.
Sachin,
Yes, sir.
yeah, you are there. I thought I am the only one who is left. All the riders
No,
has
no,
left.
sir.
So-
I'm just
so-
noting down all them email IDs.
Yeah. So just note down. I think I will take your leave, and I'll also. I hope the session was useful for everyone, and thank you for your support.
Yeah, thanks. Sir.
I'll speak to you again maybe tomorrow morning. Okay.
Yes, sir. Thank you, sir.
Okay. Bye bye.
Bye. Thanks a lot
Thank
to
you,
all
sir.
the participants who attended the session.
Rajiv, if Rajiv is there, thank you, Rajiv. I don't know if he's still there or is left.
Oh, he's logged out.
Okay. Bye.
Bye, sir.
Bye.
सचिन
Yeah, we'll stop.
या मैं आपको चैट का पूरा सेव करके भेज दूंगा. No need to note anything. Don't worry.
Yeah. Thank
I've
you.
also taken anyways.
I will give you the saved पूरा list. Don't worry.
Okay,
yes.
okay, done.
We'll stop the meeting. Okay.
Yes,
Yes,
thank
yes.
you. Thank you, Rajesh.
Thank you
Thank you
very
very
much.
much. Bye.
Bye, sir.